Okay. Mr. Jasser, I would like to ask you, what do you think about the latest situation in the Middle East? And how do you think we should promote coexistence for all religions? And how can we end the hate propaganda?
So let's take that question one piece at a time. Now, you see the situation in the Middle East. Which part would you like me to focus on? Because Syria right now is very different from Egypt and Tunisia, and the Gulf states are on a different stage. Where would you like me to focus?
Well, if you can do a generalization, actually, and start all over, because there's corruption everywhere and problems, as you stated, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Tunisia, in Egypt.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think right now you see with the so-called Arab Spring changes that finally the people, you know, my grandfather, who was in and out of house arrest in Syria in the 50s and then 60s, said, you know, when he finally gave up and left Syria and my parents came to the U.S., he said, you know, every people in some way deserves the government it has, because they either need to revolt against tyranny or they end up being subjects and slaves of tyranny. And I think similarly now the Syrians have finally woken up, the Egyptians have woken up, the Tunisians woke up, Yemenis are sort of waking up, and Bahrainis and others. So the issue is what happens after you wake up? You don't just end up all of a sudden like a light switch. You turn on democracy and it works. You need institutions, you need education, you need free markets, and you need all these other aspects to come in. But I think at the core, we need as Muslims, and I think the common element of what I tell audiences here in America and through Europe and around the world when I write, and it's in my book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam, is the message that if we can teach as Muslims that whether you're Orthodox, Sunni, or Shia, or however close you are to your faith, the best society, if the Prophet Muhammad was alive today, the best society I believe the Prophet would believe in would be one that is like America, that separates mosque and state or church and state and allows you the freedom to accept or reject God, and your identity is related to being united as pluralistic citizens under all faiths and under God, but not under one single faith. And, you know, people say, well, you know, many people who think Islam is the problem tell me that, well, the Prophet didn't separate mosque and state. And I'll say, well, where in the world was there a separation? There was nowhere. This didn't exist. Secular, like you mentioned before, laïcité did not exist successfully at the time. So Islam presented itself in the way it did, and it was successful for hundreds of years. But then after that, it failed, and the West found a solution to that, which was enlightenment and secularism. And I think the Middle East today is going through convulsions trying to get there. And we can either support the women's movements, the liberal movements, the minorities, and others that are going to build these institutions of change. But part of that support, for example, in Egypt, you can either support those groups that are going to bring real democracy, or you end up supporting the Brotherhood and the Islamists that are basically going to bring a Sunni version of Iran into being, as their constitution clearly shows, as the verbiage from Mohammed Morsi clearly shows. That's the type of domination his party is seeking. And the theocrats, the Islamists, are very often dishonest in the way they approach this. And initially Morsi said he wasn't going to run. Then he ran and said, well, they were just putting their candidacy in, and then they won in the runoff. And now he's become president, and they put forth a constitutional body that has made an Islamist Sharia state. And I think ultimately we as Muslims need to realize that we need to start speaking out and helping the Tunisians, the Egyptians, the Bahrainis, and others begin. And especially if you look in Syria, Syria right now is far from rid of Assad, and the world community has not worked together to cut off Russian influence, Iranian influence into Syria, to give those that are fighting the oppression, the opposition in Syria, to give them a chance. They have no chance so far, but yet they're fighting back. Every country in the Middle East, and even to Afghanistan and Iraq, is in a different stage of this evolution in their democratic reforms. And their revolutions are going to take, just like software, it's going to be 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, and hopefully eventually it'll get them to a democratic republic. But if the West and countries like Turkey and others that are much more financially well off and more stable, If we don't in the West get involved in Islamic reform to the Enlightenment and the secular state and help those ideas thrive in every one of those countries, we will lose the entire Middle East to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that is all about countries coming together under the banner of the Islamic State rather than under the banner of freedom and democracy and liberty, which is very different.
Yeah. So